We're going to have a legislative update and some other information purveyed by Paul Flannery, Sarasota Yacht and Ship, who is also the president of the International Yacht Brokers Association, much to his chagrin at sometimes, I think. But anyway, let's have a nice round of applause for Paul Flannery.
These mics are giving us a little hassle this afternoon. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for attending today. Another excellent Yacht Sales and the Law seminar. A lot of good information, of course. Another thing that is pertinent to all of us is that in your listing agreement is a damage disclaimer. So make sure that that gets checked one way or the other before you have your sellers sign off on your listings. Quite a few things for us to talk about. Legislatively speaking, as you all know, that the origins of the Florida Yacht Brokers Association, now the International Yacht Brokers Association, was to promote professionalism and cooperation amongst the yacht brokerage community. And the association, I think, has done a great job of that over the years. A few years ago, it became apparent to us that there were some opportunities for we as a group to help to remove some of the barriers to commerce in our industry. The first legislative effort that we put forth was a sales tax cap. We're real happy to report that that's proceeded successfully and has actually been emulated by 15 other states. So it was a really good idea, and it gave us the idea that these are things that need to be done for our industry and nobody else is really doing it. So we've chosen to focus our attentions and our efforts and our resources to doing things of that nature. As you all know, we've been working on deferred importation for a couple of years now. Staley Weidman is one of our newer board members, has taken the challenge of legislative affairs, is doing a phenomenal job with it. He's up in D.C., I think, as much as he's, well, he used to be in Tortola a lot. He's not there an awful lot anymore. But he's up in D.C. quite a lot. We have a lobbyist that works for us on a full-time basis, keeping his finger on the pulse of what's going on with our initiatives there. And deferred importation, as you'll recall, in the last Congress, was being spearheaded by Lois Frankel. It was House Resolution 4065, and the purpose of it was to remove the caveat of not available to U.S. residents while in U.S. waters for foreign flag vessels, so they could be sold to U.S. residents. That bill expired with that Congress sundowning, so it had to be reinstituted. Lois Frankel chose to sponsor virtually the same bill in the new Congress. It was given a new number, 2369. So that initiative continues forward, but with some of our new Congress people in place, there have been some other initiatives installed to try to get this legislation done. One of the things is being done by Representative Brian Mast from the 18th District, which is Palm Beach, Martin County, and I think even up into St. Lucie County. And his staff looked at what was going on. They conferred with CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and determined that the amount of revenue collected by the federal government in duty on foreign flag vessels or foreign built vessels brought into the United States is only $16 million or maybe $16.2 million annually. And in the grand scheme of things, with a budget like we have on our federal government, $16 million is nothing. It represents, at 1.5%, I think it's $1.13 billion worth of imports. So personally, I thought it would be a whole lot more than that, and I was very surprised to hear those numbers. So what CBP said was, well, wait a second, is this even worth administrating? Because we all know it's not cheap to administrate anything in government. So there's a proposal. Representative Mast has House Resolution 3662 in place that just does away with the duty in its entirety. There's another initiative that he has introduced. It has not actually been introduced and made a bill as yet. But he has another deferred importation initiative. And then for a fourth prong to the effort, Senator Bill Nelson's office, in their review for this, conferred with CBP several months ago and decided that the potential for what they called a marketing license would be a possible or a viable way to deal with the not available for U.S. residents while in U.S. waters. So what they did is they've worked on legislation to propose a marketing license that would require a bond for brokers. It wouldn't be a very high-priced bond, but what it would do is basically ensure to CBP that if you were involved in a transaction, that the duty would be collected and paid. Since that language was developed, and actually quite recently, Staley, it was just last week or so that we met with Nelson, correct? So Nelson's office now realizes that CBP has reevaluated it and said, well, if it's not worth administrating, we might be willing to do away with it entirely. So what does all this mean? It means that in the few years that we've been working on this and the efforts that we've put into it, we've actually made progress. We've gotten good traction with it. There have been administration changes, as you all may be aware. We have a new president not too long ago. He's a little controversial at times, but we have an administration that tends to be more favorable towards the types of things that we're trying to get done. And we're hopeful that before the Christmas break or the year-end break for this Congress, we're hoping that we can get our initiatives put together with one of the bills that gets passed, either under tax reform, or there's, what's the other one, Staley, that's sundowns at
well, we've got the municipal trade bill and then the omnibus bill at the end of the year.
the omnibus bill. The omnibus bill sundowns at the end of the year, and it has to be renewed. So in the event that we're not able to get our legislation pushed through prior to the end of the year, we're hopeful that it could be attached to the new omnibus bill, which would theoretically be a shoo-in at the first of the year, because that's what keeps the government rolling. So that's basically what's going on with deferred importation. Staley, as I said, has been up in D.C. quite a lot. If you have specific or targeted questions, I'm happy to field them. If I don't know the answers, Staley will. But we've been working really hard on making this happen. Omar Franco, who you all have heard from before, is our lobbyist with Becker and Polyakov up in D.C. He's doing a really good job with this. He's been on it. So we're very, very optimistic and hopeful that we'll be able to get this done by the end of the year. We've hoped that it would be done sooner than this, but we've come to learn, as we all come to learn as we're around a little while, when you're dealing with government, things don't go as quickly as you might like them to. One of the other topics that we talked about a little earlier today with the ladies from the Department of Business and Professional Regulation was Chapter 326. And of course, Chapter 326 is the Yacht and Shipbrokers Act that regulates how we do business. Laura had an excellent question with regard to a foreign broker coming into the state of Florida. What do we do? Well, according to the law, according to the Chapter 326, if a foreign broker comes in or presents an offer and is an expectation to compensation, we can't do anything with that because we're breaking the law. But let's talk about reality. What actually happens? You have a listing on a $1 million boat, or $10 million boat, I think we had in the back of the room, and you have a fiduciary responsibility to your client to use every reasonable means possible to help get his boat sold. So since a guy's not licensed here, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like I just finished talking about, deferred importation is something that really is eating up a lot of our bandwidth right now, our ability to do things legislatively. That having been said, when we've got that pretty well dialed in, we're aware of the fact that there could really be some progress made with some changes with state legislation. State legislation is a whole different kettle of fish, like we learned with deferred importation. I mean, with sales tax cap. Then you have a completely different legislature that you have to deal with. It's completely different rules. What we'd like to do is to consider what opportunities we would have to change Chapter 326 to make it more favorable for us to do business in the state and for us to look at other ways that we can enhance our abilities to do business and protect our clients, because at the end of the day, it's about a consumer protection. That's why we're licensed, that's why we're bonded, that's why the laws are in place, is to protect the consumers. It's not to make your life more difficult. So Chapter 326 is something that we have our eye towards. It's something that will be it'll be reviewed as well as we can, and as your board of directors sees that we are able to, we'll do what we can to make changes in that. So it's not a promise of something that's going to happen right away, but it's something that we are keenly aware of. And it's another thing that we feel is important to help our membership and remove barriers to commerce for our association. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about today as just an update is, as y'all are aware, and I've talked about before, we're making a move over into Europe. We've decided that we want to have a chapter over in Europe. The reason that we'd like to do that is because we'd like to build a bridge with our European partners, our European comrades or colleagues, because there's a lot more business being done between the United States and Europe. A lot of the buyers are here, a lot of the boats are there. And what we've found in looking at the European community is it's much more of a free-for-all over there. We have a structure here, we have a code of ethics, we have a set of forms, we have education, obviously you all are here today for that, we have networking events, and we have ways that make us able to raise the bar of professionalism throughout our industry. And I was actually approached by a gentleman from the European community, a fellow by the name of Hein Velema. Hein was Director of Sales for FedShip for about 7 years. He was CEO of Fraser. He's well known to a lot of you who have done business over in Europe. He's very, very well known in the European community. He's kind of a Bob Saxon of the EU, if you know what I mean. He's a mover and a shaker amongst men. Hein's very well connected, and he really has a very altruistic bent about him. He really wants to see the opportunity for us to bring what we do here for the community in the United States to the European community. So last summer I went over there and I visited with a few of the brokers, a few of the insurance companies, a few of the attorneys. I visited with a wide variety of the people in the industry, specifically in Monaco and along in that area in Gulf Juan and Cannes and Nice and in that neck of the woods. And what we found was that we were being very, very well received. The first question that everyone asked is, well, what about MEBA? And within the first paragraph, they would answer their own question. Because MEBA, as most of you know that have any familiarity with MEBA, is more than anything, they're a charter organization. They own Yacht Folio. They do have a purchase agreement that every attorney here in the room is familiar with. Many of the brokers here in the room are familiar with. It's a very different purchase agreement than what we have. The default situation in their agreement is to accept the vessel. Our default situation, if your buyer agrees to buy a boat and doesn't sign an acceptance of vessel and gets hit by a bread truck, the deal's off. It's deemed as rejected. In MEBA, in their agreement, if he gets hit by a bread truck, it's accepted, and his family's got to figure it out. So that's, in essence, one of the big differences between them. So the long and the short of it is the community over there feels like it would be really, really helpful to them to have a set of guidelines like we work under for that community. So what we've decided to do, we did an event over there at the Monaco Yacht Show, which, by the way, Monaco Yacht Show quite often, and the Cannes show before that. Cannes is pretty much the new boat show. Monaco is the big boat show. The buzz over there, as I'm sure Cindy would agree, Billy Smith was there. There were quite a few people here in the room that were there. The buzz was really, really good. It was, and no, I didn't get a buzz. The point is that there was a very, very positive outlook, a very positive feel. The brokerage community, the legal community, the insurance community, the suppliers, the builders, everybody was very, very excited about the activity that's going on. That speaks very well to what I think is an optimistic view for our Fort Lauderdale Boat Show, which is, as we all know, one of our big, big pieces of business through the year. So the buzz is good, the optimism is good, the energy is high, so we're really hopeful that Lauderdale is going to be a great show this year. But the long and the short of it was the group over there is very excited about the idea of IYBA coming to Europe, establishing a chapter there, doing educational seminars. We're talking about doing a new construction seminar as early as November 23rd. I'm waiting on confirmation of a venue right now. But what we're going to try to do is to bring education to the community there, bring a bit of cohesiveness to that community, networking events. There's a fellow by the name of Thierry Voisin who is he was an ex-president of MEBA, and he runs something called ECPY, the European Community of Professional Yachting, I think it is. They do quite a lot of open houses like we do at Bahia Mar and up in Palm Beach. I had a very nice conversation with him about the ability to do open houses in concert with one another, which gives a great opportunity for networking. And while many of you may think that, well, this is really just, like 50-meter stuff, this really doesn't apply to me, you'd be quite surprised. There's an awful lot of business that goes on over there in smaller boats. There's a lot of business there is an opportunity for a lot of business for us to do it across the pond with one another. So we think that it's an enhancement to the industry as a whole and to our membership as a whole. That's really all I have as far as updates are concerned. If you have more specific questions, as I mentioned, Staley's very, very well dialed into all the particulars. I don't think I left out any high points on what's going on with our deferred importation. And I'm really happy and really pleased to announce that our NMMA representative, I think, has arrived on the scene. Yes? Correct? Yes. Hallelujah. NMMA, the National Marine Manufacturers Association, is, as you all know, a very large organization. They have a membership of something in the realm of 350,000 members. We've been really, really blessed in that they've embraced many of our initiatives, welcomed us with open arms to the ABC, the American Boating Congress, up in Washington, where we go to lobby for our for our deferred importation efforts. They've been very supportive of us. They're a wonderful organization. And I'd like to thank and welcome our NMMA representative. Thank you.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you. Hi, it's good to be here. And rather than go through my story of why I was a little tardy, because I'm sure you're tired of people from Washington making excuses, I'll just say I'm sorry for being a little late. I came straight from the airport, and I'm very glad to be here. How many of you know Nicole Vassalaros from NMMA? Some of you do. So I'm really here in Nicole's place. Nicole had a baby in August. She's on maternity leave and spending time with Christopher. And I work for a firm called Forbes Tate Partners. We're a lobbying firm in DC, and we've been representing the National Marine Manufacturers for about a year now. Prior to that, I have represented, and my firm has represented the American Sport Fishing Association for about 10 years. And going back before that, I have worked in the outdoor recreation space for about 20 years. I'm going to move sort of quickly through some topics that I think are topics of shared interest with you all and with NMMA, things we work on day in, day out in Washington on behalf of NMMA. And I'll sort of stay top level and won't get too far down the weeds and leave us some time for questions. And then I can hang out after this session. It sounds like you all are going to have a break. If anyone wants to chat and get even deeper into the weeds, I'm always happy to do that. Things are not dull in DC on any given day. I wake up curious to see what the president has tweeted and who's tweeted back at him, and this morning was no exception. Lots of tweeting going on. And of course, there's the weekend tweets. What we are focused on mostly right now in DC, because it's something that everyone has a stake in, is the uptick in the tempo on negotiations and drafting for tax reform. We have been talking in Washington, DC about a big tax reform bill for about, depends where you want to start it, but for at least 10 years or so. It has been the white whale that many people in DC have been chasing for a long time for a wide range of interests. So last month, we had a 9-page document come out that was basically a joint product of this administration and House and Senate Republicans. And it was, I think it's fair to say, not so much a tax reform package. While there are provisions in there that would be of a reform nature, a lot of it is tax relief and some specifics that have been discussed in Washington for a long, long time. We've seen drafts of tax relief legislation presented. The biggest, most recent one was a couple of years ago. And lots of things we see in this proposal are familiar from that effort that emerged from the House. So the broad brushstrokes have been presented. The first thing that's got to happen, there are very complicated rules around doing a tax package like this. And with congressional Republicans wanting to give themselves the ability to pass something by a simple majority in the Senate rather than have 60 votes, you're going to hear a lot of talk this week and the next about approving the budget. If things go the way the Republican leadership wants them to go, they'll have a budget approved, the framework for a budget next year, which will give them the ability to proceed with tax legislation and not have to get 60 votes in the Senate. If that sounds familiar, that's how repeal and replace of Obamacare was set up. And of course, that didn't go as Republicans planned or hoped it would in Congress. The Senate's in recess this week. They'll come back next week. If this budget framework is approved, then we can expect to see actual legislative language beyond these broad brushstrokes, probably the week after next at the very soonest, more likely maybe a week after that. As to the prospects of that legislation moving, again, you cannot help these days in Washington but to go back to sort of the palace intrigue and the sniping and the tweets I referred to. Just to give you an example, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee announced his retirement recently. He and the president got in a Twitter fight over the weekend. Senator McConnell weighed in to say not anything about whether he agreed with Mr. Corker, but to remind everyone that Mr. Corker sits on the Budget Committee. All of this to say, at 52 votes, in terms of how many votes Republicans have in the Senate, you really can't afford to lose anyone. And of course, this administration should be mindful of that, given how closely they lost on their multiple attempts to do and repeal and replace of Obamacare. So if I were betting on passage of this tax reform package before the end of the year, I would have to say I don't imagine it's ultimately going to go, but we shall see. This president more recently has been spending time, as he calls them, Chuck and Nancy, with Chuck and Nancy, the Democratic leaders. There are certainly Democrats who are up for re-election in the Senate who would like to do something on tax reform and are gettable, but it is an absolute crapshoot as to whether or not the moves will be made by this administration or Republicans in Congress to reach across the aisle and get some Democrats to pad their vote, which is really what they need to do. It is more than likely on tax reform that you will lose a couple of Republicans in the Senate. At the very least, for example, you're likely to lose Rand Paul, who has already indicated that he doesn't like the road they're headed down, and as I'm sure you all know, if you follow politics, he's not afraid to buck his party as he did on repeal and replace. So I'm not going to go into the specific provisions of tax reform. I think some of them are of more interest to you as an individual, some more interest to you in terms of your business interests, but there's a lot potentially in there. As it stands now, there are things that could fall out. For example, there's speculation right now about the estate tax. There are already some Republicans saying, you know, we're already being tarred with this brush of doing a tax package that's going to predominantly provide relief for wealthy Americans. So you've got some people already on the Hill saying, let's go ahead and back that one out. So it's very fluid right now, but we'll know more soon as far as actual language. I'm going to touch on disaster relief. That's something for NMA we've been keeping a very close eye on. We're going to have the president ask for another dose of disaster relief funding to the tune of $29 billion. The House already moved on that. The Senate, when it gets back next week, will presumably approve that. That is in addition to a first dose of disaster relief funding that Congress approved that was, I believe, $16 billion. Now, both of these moves by Congress are really just to replenish accounts. Right, so FEMA spends down, the Small Business Administration spends down very quickly in the wake of Harvey. We then have Irma hit, and this is really just putting money back into those accounts. And some of you may have already interfaced with these agencies or know people who have, but they're basically just running the programs they typically do in the wake of disasters like this, and they've got to have those accounts with adequate money. The real fights will come, or opportunities, depending on your perspective, when eventually they turn to doing a disaster relief package that has more prescriptive language in it, all right? So you've already got members of Congress, whether they're from Florida or Texas or people thinking about Puerto Rico, who are looking at specific impacts in their districts or their states and thinking about how they can basically earmark money for specific purposes, okay? We don't do earmarking anymore in Washington, except on very rare occasions, and disaster relief bills provide those occasions. Some of you may recall in the wake of Sandy in the mid-Atlantic in the Northeast, some of you may be based up there, there was lots of fighting and squabbling about how much of that money was going to traditional or truly necessary disaster relief, and how some of it was perhaps being funneled towards other interests like dealing with longstanding infrastructure problems. Those sorts of things are going to come up. They probably will not get to that big disaster relief bill that will have the more prescriptive language until the end of the year. If I had to guess, you guys, I'm sure, observe Congress is like your teenager living at home and puts everything off till the absolute last minute. That's probably what will happen. So come December, we'll be dealing with potential government shutdown because they have to do a big omnibus spending package, and they'll probably be dealing with this disaster relief as well. We're also spending a lot of time these days on trade matters, and I know you guys were already discussing them as I came up, and one of particular importance to this group. In terms of looking at trade broadly, of course, NAFTA is what's taking up most of the attention, although it is amazing each day to get up and see this administration opening up new, well, depending on your perspective, points of conflict or points of engagement where they're trying to adjust past trade deals or deal with problems that they view as having been overlooked for a long time. So the people at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office at the Department of Commerce and those who work on trade are working around the clock. And of course, like with any other agency right now, and I can talk about this later, they do not have all of the top personnel on hand that they need to be doing all of this, but they are doing their best. NAFTA, the fourth round of NAFTA negotiations starts in Washington tomorrow. The first three rounds, as expected, were very sort of pro forma, agreeing on some rules, dispensing with some things very quickly that were relatively non-controversial. So they talk about tabling certain provisions that everyone agrees could use a tweak or a little adjustment and putting that aside. All of that was to set up where we are now. This is the round where everyone thought we would finally get down to the stuff that is most contentious. There are several items the administration has stuck with as being priorities that have been characterized by both Canada and Mexico as deal breakers. It's worth noting, too, that most members of Congress have referred to those specific things as being deal breakers. So it's going to be very interesting to see how hard a line is taken by this administration. To give you one example of one we're watching, rules of origin, which everyone talks about in the context of U.S. auto industry, but it actually touches some other manufacturing. You have a hard time finding anyone from the business sector or on Capitol Hill or from the two countries we're negotiating with that wants to make the kind of adjustments this administration is contemplating. So frankly, it's just very hard to see how that ends up going through. And so if they stick to these things they're referring to as must-haves, then you do eventually get to the point that the president's already talked about, which is walking away from NAFTA. That invites a whole nother conversation, which is whether or not he can do that unilaterally. There's a lot of debate about that in Washington right now, as to whether Congress could actually prevent that or at least slow it down. Again, I know I'm moving quickly, but I'm happy to take some questions and I'll be hanging around. NAFTA is the big trade thing right now. I'll just talk about the Coast Guard bill briefly. Everything has been going along swimmingly the past year or so until we got to July. The two committees of jurisdiction have moved Coast Guard reauthorization bills, which of course we've been looking for them to do for a long time. Unfortunately, in the Senate, they are hung up on vessel discharge, and in particular, issues having to do with the Great Lakes. And I have been spending a lot of time with staff in the past 2 weeks, and they are really at an impasse. You know things aren't going well when you start getting calls from staff to the lobbyists saying, can you help us do this, or can you help us do that, or will you go talk to this member, or you get your members to raise hell with that member. It's nice to get a call and ask for the help, but if they're asking for outside help pushing people, then you know they're kind of getting desperate. We can get into some of the details of that, but this is really largely a conflict having to do with members of the Great Lakes delegation, most of whom are Democrats, having a problem what they view as making the invasive species problem worse in the Great Lakes rather than better. And you have, I would say, most Republicans on the key committees, and importantly, Senator Nelson of Florida saying, look, we have worked on this for years. We've come up with some reasonable language that represents a good compromise. and you guys are just not being realistic. So it is not sort of a Republican versus Democratic thing. There are a number of Democrats who think the deal that's been cut in the Coast Guard bill, particularly as it relates to vessel discharge, is reasonable, and that certain people in the Great Lakes delegation are being unreasonable. So that is a tough one. The House moved theirs out of committee, and I think we'll get a floor vote fairly soon, and you do not have the same sort of contentious problem over there. I'll just talk briefly about marine fisheries management. It is one of the highest priorities for the National Marine Manufacturers Association. We have been trying to get, how many here know what Magnuson-Stevens is? All right, a few people. It is the big bill that sort of directs NOAA, the Department of Commerce, National Marine Fisheries, as to how to manage our federal waters. So basically all of the EEP. Not just as it pertains to fisheries management, but other uses, but a lot of the attention comes on fisheries management. It was first passed in 1976. It's meant to be reauthorized every 6 years. That, of course, does not happen. So on average, since 76, it's been reauthorized about every 10 years. It was last reauthorized in 2007, so we're at a point where you've got people saying, okay, I think it's about time to do this. Typically in fisheries management, when it comes to federal fisheries management, you have a triangle of interests. You have commercial fishing interests, you have recreational fishing interests, and you have sort of the conservation or environmental set of interests. If two of those points on the triangle agree on some things, then you tend to see Congress move towards doing a reauth. For the past couple of years, the commercial fishing industry has largely been okay with the status quo. That's not to say they don't have some things they'd like to see changed, but they've largely been okay. Same goes for the environmental community. They got some things included in the last reauthorization that they'd like to leave alone. The recreational fishing industry has put a lot of effort into making a very different case, which is to say this was written for commercial fishing. The federal government continues to try to manage recreational fishing using commercial fishing tools, and it is not working. And there's no more egregious example of that right now than management of red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, here in the South Atlantic, you've got similar issues with red snapper and other similar species. So we've made a very good case. We've got a really good piece of legislation we're calling the Modern Fish Bill. Received favorable treatment on both sides of the Hill, in the House and the Senate. And that's one, actually, I can strike an optimistic note. We're making a lot of progress there. I'd be happy to talk about that more with you out during the break or whenever else. So I'm just going to quickly close by saying we have not seen a significant piece. When I say significant, I recognize that's a totally subjective term. We haven't seen a big piece of legislation passed in Washington this year. There was speculation that for the first time in a long time with a Republican administration, Republican control of the Senate and the House, we would see that. It has not happened. And I'm frankly skeptical that it's going to happen between now and the end of the year. What will happen is we will walk up to a government shutdown. Those words used to sound a lot scarier than they do now because I think we've all just gotten numb to it. But they have to pass a budget. We're living on a continuing resolution, once again, which we do every year now. And when they do that big omnibus budget deal right before Christmas, a bunch of stuff will be added. They'll come back in 2018. It's an election year. And if you thought very little happened this year, even less will happen next year. You have 33 members of the U.S. Senate up, 25 of whom are Democrats. 10 of those 25 are running in states that Trump won. So the idea that Democrats are going to retake the Senate, pretty far-fetched. In the House, Democrats believe they've got a crack at taking control there. It's possible. I mean, these days, possible. But we'll see a year where people are very focused on elections and less inclined to work across the aisle on most issues. When it comes to those Senate races, there's really only a couple of states that I think are in play for Democrats. So they're only down 2 votes in the Senate. If they pick up 2 or 3 seats, it's possible. It's a long shot. I actually think it's more likely Democrats can win enough seats to take control of the House. And then I'll just pause and imagine what it will be like in Washington if that were to happen. So with that, I know I covered a lot. I moved kind of quickly. I just want to give you a little feel for stuff we're focused on in MMA and a little bit of a flavor for the political backdrop. But I'll stop there and see if anyone has questions. Yes?
A lot of Americans are learning about the Jones Act for the first time.
Yeah.
There have been a few bills I know introduced either to have permanent waivers for Puerto Rico or 5-year waivers. Do you think those are likely to get any traction, and is there any possibility of an outright repeal?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. You know, there's been more attention paid to the Jones Act in the past couple of months than there has been in the past 10 years. It was interesting to me, I think just today, that temporary waiver expired. You have people like Senator McCain who have long talked about the fact that it makes no sense. Now, is he going to take this attention that's been cast on the Jones Act to follow through and try to get something passed? I'm not sure. I think it was very telling to watch how the administration resisted the waiver for Puerto Rico. I don't follow this one closely enough to know exactly why that was, but it's very clear that there were interests working hard and to good effect to keep the Trump administration back from doing that. My best guess, and as I say, as someone who doesn't follow this closely, is that at the end of the year, whether it's around disaster relief legislation or the omnibus, you will see a run at someone trying to deal with this to say, look, we all saw how ridiculous this was, or if there are takes on the other side to do something on it. But I'm not aware of any specific effort on that right now. It's a really good question. I just, my gut would tell me someone will take a run at that at the end of the year. So many more people now know about the Jones Act than they used to. That's for sure.
Do you see anything that's going to help the American shipyards get back competitive again?
Yeah, and I should have mentioned this, and I didn't because it's kind of gone into the background a bit, but there's still talk of doing a big infrastructure package. And, I guess it depends on your view as to what's being considered. There's a hearing actually this week in the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee on infrastructure and specifically on coastal infrastructure and improving shipyards. So there was a lot of excitement about infrastructure at the beginning of the year. I think, frankly, if the president had started with infrastructure, there were a ton of Democrats who were excited to do that. They would have had to navigate how to pay for it and all that other stuff, but that would have been a great way to start. It's how President Obama started. When you have that sort of capital coming right off of your election, it's a great place to start. Things blew up pretty quickly. Right now, the talk in Washington is if you're going to do a tax reform package, can we couple some infrastructure investment to that? It's feeling kind of shaky. But people aren't giving up on it. The administration is actually making a renewed push on it and engaging more meaningfully than they have earlier in the year. It was weird that they weren't putting more effort into it and that effort wasn't of greater quality. They are now having a lot of meetings with people on the Hill, and they're actually getting into language. The big problem is always how do you pay for it, right? And so the idea had been if you had done repeal and replace of Obamacare, you would have taken the savings from that and used some of it for tax reform and some of it for infrastructure. They didn't get that revenue they thought they might get. But the answer to your question is when people talk about that, they talk about it in terms of infrastructure. We probably don't get one done this year, but there's just too much bipartisan agreement on the need to deal with our infrastructure problems not to eventually do something. It may just take a while.
George, we're going on break. Can I ask you to hold court in the lobby here for
Yeah, sure.
about 20 minutes if we can?
Yeah.
And Paul, do you want to excuse us? All right, we're going to take about a 20-minute break right now. We have one more great session following this. Thanks so much, George. It was great information. Paul, thank you.
George, thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. I'm sorry I was
Glad
tardy.
you made it.
Yeah.
Glad you made it.